It was 2:17 in the morning when the rain turned violent. Sheets of water hammered the pavement outside the emergency entrance, so thick the streetlights blurred into smears of orange and white. Then the silence of the storm broke apart. Tires screamed against wet asphalt. A black SUV came tearing around the corner, swerved, and crashed straight through the hospital's metal security gate. Metal shrieked. Sparks exploded into the rain. The vehicle skidded to a stop inches from the sliding glass doors. For half a second, nobody moved. Then the doors of the SUV flew open, and 6 men in black suits poured out into the storm, moving fast, moving with purpose, rain soaking through their jackets in seconds. They didn't look like family members bringing in an accident victim. They looked like men who were used to giving orders and having them obeyed instantly. One of them wrenched open the back door. A man collapsed out onto the wet pavement, and even through the downpour, the blood was unmistakable, dark, spreading, soaking through his white shirt at the shoulder and lower ribs. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, his eyes fluttering somewhere between consciousness and something worse. Get help. Now, one of the suited men roared, his voice cutting through the rain. The automatic door slid open and hospital staff spilled out. A nurse, an orderly, a security guard reaching instinctively for his radio. But the moment they saw the men surrounding the wounded stranger, they hesitated. These weren't ordinary visitors. There was something in the way they stood, shoulders squared, eyes scanning every direction, hands twitching near their jackets like they were used to carrying more than phones. "Sir, we need to know who he is," a young doctor said, holding up both hands. "What happened to him? Was he shot?" "Just save him," the tallest of the men said. His voice was flat, controlled, but there was an edge underneath it that made the doctor take an involuntary step back. "You don't need his name. You need to keep him breathing." "I can't treat a patient with no information, no ID, no." "Then get someone who can." The standoff might have gone on longer if not for the woman who came running out of the sliding doors at that exact moment, breathless, her sneakers slapping against the wet concrete. Naomi Johnson had been in the middle of restocking a supply cart 3 floors up when the code came through, and she hadn't stopped moving since. She was in her late 20s, her dark brown skin catching the flashing light of a distant ambulance, her black box braids pulled back and already damp from the rain. A thin silver cross necklace swung against her collarbone as she dropped to her knees beside the bleeding man without a second's hesitation. Multiple gunshot wounds, shoulder and lower abdomen, heavy blood loss, she said, her hands already moving, checking his pulse, pressing against the worst of the bleeding. "I need a gurney out here right now." "Naomi, wait," the young doctor started. "I don't care who these men are," Naomi said, not even looking up. "This man is dying. Somebody get me a gurney." One of the suited men, the tallest one, the one who'd spoken first, stared down at her for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, some recalibration he didn't explain. Then he stepped back and let her work. The gurney came. Naomi helped lift the wounded man onto it herself, her hands slick with his blood, her voice steady even as her heart hammered. "Stay with me," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Stay with me." They wheeled him through the doors, down the fluorescent-lit corridor, Naomi jogging alongside the gurney, calling out vitals, shouting for a trauma team, refusing to let go of his hand even as they burst through the doors of the operating room. The doors swung shut behind them. Outside, in the parking lot, in the pouring rain, something extraordinary was happening. 1 black SUV became 5. 5 became 20. Within 20 minutes, more than 50 identical luxury vehicles had arrived, silent, headlights off, parked in perfect formation around the entire perimeter of the hospital, as if the building itself was under siege from the outside, or under protection. Nobody watching could have said which. Naomi Johnson had been a nurse for 6 years, and in that time she had learned exactly how far a paycheck could stretch and exactly how far it couldn't. She worked double shifts more often than not, sometimes staying past midnight simply because the ward was short-staffed and she couldn't bring herself to leave patients in the hands of an exhausted skeleton crew. Every month, a portion of that paycheck went straight to her mother, who had raised Naomi and her younger brother alone since their father passed, and who still lived in the same modest house Naomi had grown up in. Every month, another portion went toward her brother's textbooks, his bus fare, the small things that added up when you were the only one left holding a family together. What was left over, Naomi put toward a dream she rarely spoke about out loud. She wanted to become a trauma surgeon. She had wanted it since she was 16 years old, since the night her father had come home late from one of his mission trips with blood on his shirt that wasn't his own, and had calmly, quietly, talked Naomi through how to clean and dress a wound while her mother stood in the doorway, hand over her mouth. But medical school cost money Naomi didn't have, and scholarships were competitive, and every year she told herself next year, and every year something came up that made next year recede a little further into the distance. She thought about it sometimes on nights like this one, sitting in the break room with a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring at a brochure for a surgical residency program she'd requested 3 months ago and still hadn't found the courage to fill out. Tonight, there was no time to think about any of it. By sunrise, the entire hospital had transformed into something Naomi barely recognized. Administrators who normally stayed locked in their offices were pacing the halls, phones pressed to their ears, voices hushed and urgent. Police cruisers sat outside with their lights off, officers standing at careful distances, watchful, but not interfering. At one point, Naomi passed a man in an expensive suit speaking rapidly into a phone, and she caught only a fragment of what he said. "If word gets out that he's here, we have a serious problem," before he noticed her and lowered his voice further. Nobody explained anything to her. Nobody told her who the man in room 412 actually was, or why armed guards stood outside his door in rotating shifts, or why the hospital director himself had come down twice already to check on his condition personally. Naomi didn't ask. She simply did what she always did. She checked his vitals every hour. She changed his dressings. She adjusted his foredrip and made careful notes in his chart under the name the hospital had temporarily assigned him, John Doe, room 412, because nobody had given her anything else to write. It was well past midnight on the second night when she found herself alone in his room, changing the bandages across his ribs, the low hum of the monitors the only sound besides the rain still tapping gently against the window. He hadn't opened his eyes once since he'd been wheeled into the OR. His face was slack with unconsciousness, but his features were sharp even in sleep, a strong jaw, dark hair damp against his forehead, a thin scar above his left eyebrow that told her this wasn't the first time he'd been this close to dying. Naomi worked in silence for a while, her hands gentle despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. And then, without quite meaning to, she found herself speaking. "I don't know who you are," she said quietly, barely above a whisper, as she pressed a fresh bandage against his side. "I don't know what you did, or who did this to you, or why there are 50 cars outside this building like it's about to be invaded." She paused, checking the monitor, then looked back down at his still face. "But as long as you're breathing, I'm not giving up on you. That's not how this works. Not on my watch." For a moment, nothing happened. Then she felt it, the faintest pressure against her hand. His fingers, weak and barely there, curling slightly around hers. Naomi froze. She looked down at their hands, then up at his face. His eyes were still closed. His breathing hadn't changed. But she knew what she'd felt, and something in her chest tightened in a way she couldn't quite explain. "Okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Okay. I hear you." The hospital director called an emergency meeting at 4 in the morning, gathering only the most senior staff into a windowless conference room and locking the door behind them. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room," he said, his hands trembling slightly as he set a folder down on the table. "Not to your families, not to your colleagues, not to anyone." He opened the folder. Inside was a single printed photograph, along with a page of information that made every doctor in the room go pale as they read it. "The patient in room 412, the director said, his voice tight, is Kang Tae-Hyun." Nobody spoke. A few of the older doctors actually leaned back in their chairs, as if putting physical distance between themselves and the name could somehow undo what they'd just heard. "Kang Tae-Hyun," one doctor finally repeated, disbelief cracking his voice. "The Kang Tae-Hyun?" His organization controls shipping routes, financial networks, and enterprises across half of Asia. The director continued grimly. Billions of dollars move through channels connected to his name. And every rumor I have ever heard about the man says the same thing. Nobody who crosses him survives long enough to regret it. The room had gone deathly quiet. One of the younger nurses actually pressed a hand to her mouth. "We treat him like any other patient," the director said. "We say nothing. We do nothing to draw attention. Is that understood?" Heads nodded around the table, quick and nervous. Fear had settled over the room like a physical weight. Naomi, who had been called in only because she was his primary nurse, sat near the back, absorbing the information with far less panic than everyone around her. "Ms. Johnson," the director said, turning to her. "Given what you now know, I need to ask, are you comfortable continuing as his nurse? Nobody would blame you for requesting reassignment." Every eye in the room turned to her. Naomi thought of the way his fingers had curled weakly around hers just hours earlier. She thought of the fear on the faces of the men who had watched him bleed out on the pavement, men who were clearly used to being the ones who inspired fear, not felt it. She thought about what her father used to say, that the sickest people in the world were often the ones nobody else wanted to touch. "He's still my patient," she said simply. The director blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Miss Johnson, you understand who this man is." "I understand he has a pulse and a fever and a wound that could get infected if nobody keeps it clean," Naomi said, standing. "I don't care what he's done outside these walls. Inside them, he's a patient, and I don't abandon patients because they scare me." She left the room before anyone could argue further. The attack came at 1 a.m. the following night, and it very nearly succeeded. Naomi was 3 doors down, checking on another patient, when something made her pause. She couldn't have explained it at the time, just an instinct, a wrongness in the rhythm of the hallway. She stepped out and saw a woman in nursing scrubs entering room 412, moving with quiet efficiency toward the 4 stand. Naomi's eyes caught 3 things in rapid succession. The woman's ID badge was clipped upside down, a small detail, but not one any real nurse would ever make. Her shoes were wrong. 2. Clean white sneakers instead of the standard non-slip clogs every staff member wore on this floor. And her hands were moving toward the 4 line with a syringe already uncapped, prepping an injection without pulling up a single chart, without checking a single vital sign first. "Excuse me," Naomi said, stepping through the doorway. "Can I ask what you're administering?" The woman's head snapped up. For just a moment, something cold and calculating flickered across her face before the mask of professionalism slid back into place. "Routine medication. Doctor's orders." "There's no order in his chart for anything tonight," Naomi said, her voice level even as her pulse spiked. "I need you to step away from that line." The fake nurse didn't step away. She lunged. What followed happened in a blur, the syringe swinging toward the 4 port, Naomi grabbing the woman's wrist with both hands, the 2 of them crashing into the monitor stand, alarms shrieking to life as wires ripped loose. The woman was strong, stronger than her slight frame suggested, and for a terrifying few seconds Naomi genuinely believed she might lose this fight. "Security!" Naomi screamed, wrenching the woman's arm hard enough to send the syringe clattering across the floor, its contents spilling harmlessly onto the tile. "I need security in room 412 now." Boots pounded down the hallway. 2 of Kang's own guards burst through the door first, weapons already drawn, and behind them came hospital security. The fake nurse tried to bolt for the window, but she never made it. The guards tackled her to the floor before she'd taken 3 steps, pinning her down as she thrashed and screamed something in a language Naomi didn't recognize. Naomi stood there, chest heaving, staring down at the shattered syringe on the floor, and understood with sudden clarity that she had just saved this man's life for the 2nd time in 3 days, without him ever knowing it was happening. Morning came gray and quiet. The storm finally passed, sunlight breaking weakly through the clouds outside room 412's window. Naomi was adjusting his 4 drip, checking the dressing that covered the worst of his wounds, when she heard it, a small, rasping breath that wasn't part of the machine's rhythm. She looked up. His eyes were open, Dark, sharp, and startlingly alert for a man who had been unconscious for 3 days, Kang Tae-Hyun's gaze moved slowly around the unfamiliar room before settling on her. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Where? His voice came out cracked, barely audible. He tried again. Where am I? You're in a hospital, Naomi said gently, setting down her clipboard and stepping closer. You've been unconscious for 3 days. You were shot. Twice. He absorbed this slowly, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he were trying to place her, trying to understand something he couldn't quite grasp yet. Were you? He swallowed, wincing at the effort. Were you the one who stayed? Naomi hesitated, unsure exactly what he meant, but something in his expression told her the question mattered more than its simplicity suggested. I've been your nurse since you arrived, she said.
So yes.
I've been here. He studied her for another long moment. Then the door opened, and 2 of his men stepped in, immediately straightening, waiting for instruction, their whole posture shifting to attention the way soldiers respond to a general. Sir, we've secured the floor. We can move you to a private facility within the hour, somewhere more. Leave, Kang said quietly. The guards blinked. Sir? I said leave. All of you. Now. There was a beat of stunned hesitation, and then the guards backed out of the room without another word, closing the door softly behind them. Naomi glanced toward the hallway, where she could see the silhouettes of at least 4 more guards now stationed just outside, and then back at the man in the bed, who was still watching her with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time since this whole ordeal began, genuinely unsettled. You didn't ask who I am, he said. I know who you are, Naomi said honestly. I heard the name yesterday. It doesn't change what I do in this room. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close to it, something that looked almost unfamiliar on a face carved from years of guardedness. Most people, he said slowly, would have run the moment they found out. I'm not most people, Naomi said, and went back to adjusting his four. It was later that same afternoon, while she was checking his temperature, that Kang's eyes fixed on something at her collarbone, and he went suddenly, completely still. That necklace, he said. Where did you get it? Naomi's hand went instinctively to the small silver cross resting against her skin. It was my father's, she said. He gave it to me before he passed. Why? Kang didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the composed, controlled mask he'd worn since waking slipped entirely, revealing something raw underneath. Memory, maybe, or grief, or disbelief. Years ago, he said finally, his voice low, during a war between rival organizations, I was ambushed. Shot twice, left for dead in an alley in the pouring rain, much like the night you found me. I would have died there. I should have died there. Naomi lowered the thermometer slowly, listening. A man found me, Kang continued. A missionary. American. He didn't ask who I was or what I'd done. He pulled me into an abandoned building, cleaned my wounds with what little he had, and stayed with me through the night, talking to me the entire time, so I wouldn't lose consciousness. He wore a necklace exactly like that one. I remember staring at it while he worked, using it to stay focused, to stay awake. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. I searched for him for years afterward, Kang said. I wanted to repay him, to thank him properly, but he'd already moved on before I could track him down, and eventually the trail went cold. I never learned his name. I only knew he had a family somewhere, a wife, 2 children. What did he look like? Naomi's voice came out barely above a whisper. Kang described him. The height, the gentleness in his voice even under pressure. A particular way of tilting his head while he worked, like he was listening to something only he could hear. Naomi sat down slowly in the chair beside his bed, her legs no longer entirely steady beneath her. That was my father, she said. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy between them. Kang stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as a nurse, not as a stranger, but as a thread connecting him to a debt he had carried, unpaid, for over a decade. Your father saved my life, he said quietly. And without knowing it, without ever being told any of this, his daughter has now saved mine. Twice. Naomi didn't know what to say. She simply sat there, her father's necklace warm against her skin, and let the weight of the coincidence, or perhaps it wasn't a coincidence at all, settle over the room. The peace didn't last. Word had gotten out. It always did, eventually, in a world like the one Kang came from, and by the following evening a rival syndicate had learned exactly where their greatest enemy lay recovering, undefended, in a hospital bed. The first gunshot shattered a window on the ground floor just after 9 p.m. What followed was chaos. Armed men in ski masks stormed the lobby, exchanging fire with Kang's guards near the main entrance while patients screamed and hospital staff scrambled for cover. Alarms blared through every corridor. Somewhere below, a nurse was shouting for everyone to get down, to move away from the windows, to find shelter. Naomi's first instinct wasn't to run toward the exits. It was to run toward the children's ward. She found 6 kids and 2 terrified parents huddled in the corner of the playroom, and she immediately began herding them toward the supply closet at the back, working as calmly and quickly as her racing heart would allow. "It's okay," she kept saying, over and over, to the children and to herself in equal measure. "You're going to be okay. Stay close to me." Gunfire echoed somewhere on the floor below, closer now, and one of the younger children began to cry. Naomi knelt in front of him, gently wiping his tears, her voice never wavering even as her hands trembled. "I need you to be brave for me, okay? Just a little longer." 2 floors up, in a wheelchair he shouldn't have been strong enough to sit in yet, Kang Tae-Hyun watched all of this unfold on a hallway monitor, his guards flanking him, weapons drawn, ready to move him to safety the moment he gave the word. He didn't give the word. He watched Naomi Johnson, a woman with no weapon, no armor, nothing but her own body between danger and a room full of frightened children, refuse to leave until every single one of them was safely locked away. He watched her stand in the doorway of that supply closet, arms spread slightly, as if she alone could stop a bullet from reaching the children behind her. Something broke open in his chest that he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. For the first time in more than 15 years, Kang Tae-Hyun felt tears slide down his face, and he made no attempt to hide them from the men standing beside him. The attack was repelled within the hour. Kang's men, reinforced by a second wave of guards who'd arrived the moment the alarm went out, overwhelmed the intruders before real tragedy could unfold. Naomi emerged from the supply closet with 6 children and 2 parents, all unharmed, all shaking, all alive. She never saw Kang watching her from that hallway monitor. She never knew, in that moment, that the feared boss of one of Asia's most powerful organizations had wept at the sight of her protecting strangers who meant nothing to her, nothing except that they were human and frightened and needed someone to stand between them and the dark. Weeks passed. Naomi eventually assumed Kang had been discharged and transferred elsewhere for continued recovery, as high-profile patients often were, and she went back to the rhythm of her ordinary life. Double shifts, phone calls home, the same brochure sitting untouched in the same drawer. So she was more than a little confused when, one afternoon, the hospital director personally asked her to attend what he described only as a small recognition ceremony in the main auditorium. She almost didn't go. She had a shift starting in 2 hours and a stack of charts still waiting on her desk. But something in the director's expression told her this wasn't something she could skip, so she went, still in her scrubs, expecting a certificate and a round of polite applause. What she found instead left her frozen in the doorway. The auditorium was full, hospital staff, a small group of administrators, and near the front, standing tall and steady in a way that told her his recovery was complete, was Kang Tae-Hyun, dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable until his eyes found hers across the room. The director stepped forward first, holding a folder, and began to explain, his voice thick with something between disbelief and gratitude. Naomi's medical school tuition had been paid in full, not a scholarship, not a loan, but every single semester, every book, every fee, covered anonymously months in advance. Her mother's mortgage, the one Naomi had been quietly helping pay down for years, had been paid off entirely, the deed sent directly to her mother's name with no explanation attached. Her younger brother had received a full 4-year university scholarship, tuition and housing included, to any school of his choosing. And in the east wing of the hospital, construction had already begun on an entirely new pediatric emergency wing. Funded, the plaque would eventually read, in honor of a missionary who had once believed that mercy mattered more than fear. Naomi's father's name was on that plaque. She stood in the middle of the auditorium, hand pressed against her mouth, unable to speak, as the weight of it all settled over her at once. Kang never once claimed credit publicly. He never asked the staff to acknowledge his role, never allowed his name near any of it. When Naomi finally found her way through the crowd to stand in front of him, her eyes still wet, he simply looked at her with the same quiet intensity he'd had the moment he first opened his eyes in that hospital bed. "Years ago," he said softly, "your father taught me that strength isn't measured by fear. It's measured by mercy. I carried that lesson with me for a long time, and I forgot it more often than I should have." He paused, his composure nearly slipping. "Last night in that supply closet, you reminded me." Naomi didn't trust herself to speak. She simply nodded, tears finally spilling over. "I won't stay," Kang said. "This isn't my world, and it never will be. But I wanted you to know that what your father did for me, what you did for me without even knowing why, has not gone unanswered. Not this time." He turned to leave, his guards falling into step behind him as they always did, a small procession moving toward the doors and the black SUV waiting beyond them. At the threshold, he stopped, glancing back one final time. "Take care of yourself, Dr. Johnson," he said. "Because that's what you'll be soon enough." Naomi watched him go, watched the convoy pull away into the afternoon light and disappear around the corner, and understood, standing there in the middle of a room full of people who now knew her name for reasons that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with a stranger's gratitude, that one decision, one choice made in the middle of a violent storm at 2:17 in the morning, to treat a dying man like he was still worth saving, had quietly changed the course of her entire life, and the lives of everyone she loved. Sometimes the greatest miracles in this world don't happen because someone was powerful. They happen because, when everyone else chose fear, someone chose kindness instead.